Hi, everyone. I see that people are joining, so we're just going to give it a second here. As folks hop on, feel free to go grab your dinner or grab a snack, something food related, so that you have it with you as we get started. And we'll start in just a minute here. Okay, people are still joining and that is great, but I think we'll get started. Hopefully everyone has their little snack or whatever it might be. And yeah, let's get going. So hi everyone, and an official welcome to tonight's webinar, What's the Carbon Footprint of My Meal? My name's Alyssa and I'm the project coordinator for the Bow Valley Climate Action Society. And we are really excited to be hosting this webinar because well, climate change and food are super connected. In Canada as a whole, agriculture accounts for, the numbers kind of vary, but 9 to 12% of our total greenhouse gas production, which means that if we're going to act on climate change, we need to be thinking about the food that we eat. And so this is, of course, sometimes hard to do because there's so much information out there. But hopefully by the end of tonight's webinar, we'll all have learned a few ways that we can reduce the carbon footprint of our food and understand a bit more the system in which we get our food. So tonight's webinar is part of our project series called Envisioning and Preparing for Our Low Carbon Future, where over the past several months, we've run webinars and challenges and made videos about zero emissions vehicles, low emissions buildings, and of course, food. And this has all been made possible by our gracious funders, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen here. The Banff Canmore Community Foundation, the Town of Banff, and the Town of Canmore. So we want to express our gratitude to these funders for their support. And our webinar tonight is, of course, going to dive into the nuanced topic of the intersection between food and climate change. So we can't start talking about food without acknowledging the land that it comes from and the role that the original stewards of this land have played and continue to play in tending to and protecting these lands and waters. And in the Bow Valley, we reside on land known as Treaty 7, which is the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, as well as being the traveling grounds for many others. So we feel very lucky to be able to work, live, gather, and eat on this land. Now, a few quick notes before we get started. One, this webinar is being recorded. So if you need to leave at any time, that's a-okay. You can check back on our Facebook page tomorrow and we'll post the recording there so you can get caught up. We have a chat function at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure folks are familiar with Zoom now. So we invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat, say where you're calling in from, and at any time share your knowledge and experience with the group. We really encourage that. And finally, we also at the bottom of your screen have a separate button that says Q&A. After the presentations, we'll be having a chance to ask some questions to our speakers. And so at any time, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A function. And you'll also notice that once people type in a question, you have the ability to upvote a question. So you can basically give it a thumbs up and that'll say, yes, I want this question answered. And we'll make sure that we answer, the most popular questions first if we're in a time crunch. So with all that said, I think we can get started. Over the next hour, we'll have two short presentations on different dimensions of the food and climate change discussion, followed by a game of trivia and some time for Q&A. So we're excited to get started, and in order to do so, I would like to introduce our speakers. So with us tonight, we have two presenters. We have Andrew Rushmere from Farmers for Climate Solutions and Shannon Ripley, who is our compost guru and soil scientist. And I'll start by introducing Andrew. Andrew has been a small-scale organic market farmer for over 13 years. He has also worked and volunteered in the academic, NGO, and not-for-profit sectors, overseeing programs in organic agriculture teaching and research, sustainable agriculture policy advocacy, and curriculum development and implementation. His experience feeds his commitment to advance system-level solutions to the climate emergency with farmers. Welcome, Andrew. And our second speaker will be Shannon. Shannon is the volunteer chair of the Bow Valley Climate Action Society. She's a trained soil scientist and environmental scientist and is a professional agrologist. Shannon has been working in the fields of composting, waste diversion, and waste management for the past 15 years. She grew up in southern Alberta and has also lived in Latin America, Yellowknife, and various communities across Canada. So we're super grateful to our presenters for being with us tonight. And maybe Andrew, we can start with you if you want to share your screen and start with your presentation on climate change and its connection with agriculture.
Okay, you bet. Thanks so much, Alyssa. And I'm just going to see if I can share the right screen here with everybody. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let me get the slideshow started. And yeah, thanks for the lovely introduction, Alyssa, and thanks to the Bow Valley Climate Action folks for organizing this webinar. It's super well organized and it's a great group of folks. I know Shannon from a previous life, and so it's really fun for me to be here with all of you and share a little bit about the work of Farmers for Climate Solutions and how we're approaching this this tangle of problems in climate change and agriculture. And I'll be really excited to hear questions at the end and kind of get to engage a little bit too. So I'm going to zip through the slide deck. Alyssa gave a bit of an introduction. I myself am located in traditional unceded Cowichan territory on Vancouver Island. And I joined the Farmers for Climate Solutions team in October of last year. And my role is basically coordinating the rollout of a national training program for farmers to train farmers in adopting climate-friendly farming practices. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But if I start for now with Farmers for Climate Solutions, Farmers for Climate Solutions is a national coalition of farmer-led and farmer-supporting organizations who believe that agriculture must be part of the solution for climate change. So we are working to advocate for programs and policies that will help Canadian farmers mitigate and adapt to climate change. And really what we're trying to do is create a dialogue between farmers and the public and decision makers to find practical climate solutions. And we do this through training farmers, both in climate-friendly farming practices and creating space for farmers to share stories about climate impacts on their farm, practical solutions, and policy recommendations. We try to put the farmers kind of front and center in leadership roles here and build their capacity and train them to be active in this work. This slide is a slide that shows you all of our members. So Farmers for Climate Solutions is a relatively new organization. It was only started in February 2020, and it was created out of the realization that, from a lot of those initial members, like who were doing action on their farm, trying to mitigate climate change, they were realizing that individual action alone on their farm was not going to solve the issues we face today. There was a consensus among these groups that were working together that working on policy at the federal level was critical to addressing climate issues associated with agriculture. And so they formed this coalition. Now, there were initially 6 groups as part of this coalition when it was launched in February 2020. And only 2 years later, we've grown to 24 members who you can see here. And those 24 members represent a combined total of 20,000 farmers from coast to coast in Canada. So that's about 10% of the total farming population represented here. I've talked a little bit about what we do. These are the 3 main areas in which we work. So there's the policy advocacy area, which is both at the provincial and federal and territorial levels. There's farmer training through what we call our farm program, our farm resilience mentorship program. And then there's general capacity building in the sector, meaning that we're trying to both provide funding and training and skills to individual farmers and farm organizations to increase their capacity to do climate advocacy and climate training in the sector. Threaded throughout all our work is a really strong commitment to equity. We're really committed to fostering social inclusion and diversity in agriculture. And when I'm talking about equity and diversity and inclusion, what we're talking about is young farmers, women farmers, farmers with disabilities, Black farmers, Indigenous farmers and food providers, farmers of color, small-scale farmers, two-spirit LGBTQ plus farmers, new Canadian farmers. These are all the folks who often experience additional and unique barriers to succeed in the sector. And we recognize that just increasing diversity in the sector without addressing systemic barriers that equity deserving farmers face isn't good enough. So we're committed as an organization to transforming structures and knowledge systems and practices to better serve these equity deserving farmers. As a first step, what we did was we learned directly from farmers with lived experience as equity deserving folks, and they helped us develop an equity framework. They led that process. And this framework is what guides us in all of our work and includes several recommendations to better include and support equity deserving farmers in everything that we do. So I think Shannon's giving some context, some broader context about agriculture and climate change in Canada, but I just want to highlight a couple key numbers here before I go on. Alyssa already highlighted the one that somewhere between 9 and 12% of our total GHG emissions in Canada are associated with agriculture. That equaled about 73 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions in 2019. And most of that comes from cows, from methane. Most that's either, you could just say cows, or manure handling is a smaller part of that too. And the second largest chunk comes from the use and manufacture of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So that's going to be important to hold in mind as we go along here. I wanted to talk just very briefly about some of the initial achievements that Farmers for Climate Solutions has enjoyed in our very short life to move the needle on agricultural climate action. The first goal for us was to ensure that the federal government recognized that farmers and ranchers have a role to play in addressing climate change. We're often demonized as part of the problem, and that is absolutely true. But there's also a lot that we can do because collectively we steward an enormous amount of land in Canada. So we started lobbying the federal government in 2020. And the first success was after speaking with the Minister of Agriculture and other government officials. We saw a lot of our language verbatim in the government's throne speech. This was really exciting. This was followed by a pretty clear commitment to agricultural climate issues in the Minister of Agriculture's mandate letter in January 2021. That mandate letter had never before included references to climate change. So that was pretty exciting to see. And that was a direct result of lobbying from FCS. We also created, with the help, we brought together a task force of experts chaired by farmers to work on recommendations leading up to the 2021 federal budget process. So this task force did a really deep dive into the most impactful ways that Canada could start promoting on-farm climate action. And there were several key findings from this report, but I'm going to, in the interest of time here, I'm going to skip over a couple of them. Basically, the short story is, if you compare Canada to EU and the US, we were putting in Canada far fewer resources to fight climate change through agriculture than the EU and the US. The breakdown of what we recommended through that budget process is, you can see right here. There were 6 main things we recommended to the government. The amazing thing for us was they took up 5 of those wholesale. So that was another big success. The first 5 they took up with a huge focus on the first 3, basically reducing nitrogen use, helping increase the adoption of cover cropping, and helping normalize this idea of rotational grazing. So we can get into that maybe later, each one of those, if you're interested in the Q&A. But right now, most of our work in training terms is focused on those first 3 practices. This is this is where we get into some of the boring policy stuff that I could for some folks anyway, that I could skip over pretty quickly. But the impact of our budget recommendations could also be seen in this document that's titled the Nationally Determined Contribution. And this document basically outlines how Canada is going to meet our emissions reductions under the Paris Climate Accord. And in this document, again, we saw a whole bunch of FCS language that we had sort of fed to the government used verbatim, which was very exciting because this is a very important document for meeting our climate goals nationally. And more recently, another success that we've had is the government just earlier this spring released their 2030 emissions reduction plan, which is this legally binding document that sort of lays out the targets in various sectors that the government has to meet by 2030 to hit our overall GHG emissions reductions target of 40 to 45% below 2005 levels. In agriculture, in our little corner, there was a $900 million announcement, and it was split up in the way that this slide splits it up here. We can get into those details later, but again, that $900 million was a direct result of FCS lobbying efforts, which is really exciting for us. So we've had a lot of success initially, and now what we're turning our efforts towards is something called the Agricultural Policy Framework. This is basically sort of a policy cycle that lasts 5 years. The next Agricultural Policy Framework runs from 2023 to 2028, and it is super important in Canada because the bulk of Canadian taxpayer spending in agriculture happens through the APF. And so we're pushing really hard to make sure that basically the APF is viewed through a climate lens. And there were several initial successes in those efforts already, but I'm going to skip over those for now to get to some other points here, and we can talk about that later if you're interested. So mostly I've gone through some of the policy work that we focus on, and I've got about 5 minutes left, and I'm just gonna turn towards our training program that we're developing. And this is the main thing that I'm a part of at FCS. So we're developing this over 4 years, this peer-to-peer training program called the Farm Resilience Mentorship Program, where we're training farmers in those 3 practices that I mentioned from the 2021 budget recommendations. We're training them to adopt nitrogen reduction, nitrogen management strategies, cover cropping, and rotational grazing. Our goal is to train 10,000 farmers over 2 million acres. That those 10,000 farmers represent 2 million acres in adopting these practices. We're starting with a pilot program this year, and then we'll have 3 years after that to keep on going. And so far, it's been received very well, and we're really excited about this. When you come down to personal food choices, so most of what I've been talking about here is sort of collective action from a coalition, lots of policy advocacy. When you get down to the title of this webinar and you're coming down to personal food choices, FCS in a way is a bit at odds potentially with the title of the webinar, though we recognize that action needs to happen on every single level, individual up to the structural change level and the kind of policy advocacy and the big systems change. I just want to highlight that these next couple of slides, I want to recognize that personal food choices are really important if we're talking about individual choices. We all need to be making different choices, but they may be limited in effectiveness depending on how they are enacted. And they're also deeply personal. So it's not fair necessarily to ask somebody to make a personal food choice because everybody's aware so many different factors go into our personal food choices, including our religious background, cultural background, our social structures around us. There's all sorts of things that make it a very complicated question. So what I want to focus on is, if we're talking about what can individuals do to make an impact here, this title I hope says it all. Work and talk together. The together piece is pretty important. So yes, make individual changes. But if you can, and to the extent that you're able, and obviously not everybody is able and doesn't have the time and doesn't have the I've got kids, I understand. Sometimes you just don't have the time. And lots of people, it's also a privilege to be able to kind of do social action work in a lot of ways and environmental action work, but work on systemic social change as well as individual lifestyle choices. Another really important thing is to talk about climate change in agriculture. I know that seems funny, but what often happens, what's happened historically here for a long time, is that it's uncomfortable to talk about climate change because it's scary and it's not a pleasant party topic. But we really do need to daylight this, and so we need to talk about it more broadly and with more people in our lives to normalize this is happening. We all have to do something about it. And we want to do this together. Don't do this alone. It's incredibly demoralizing to do this work alone. Join up with people. You'll hear people like Elizabeth May say this all the time. Don't do this work alone. When you're talking about the carbon footprint of my meal and personal choices you can make, to boil it down in the simplest terms possible here, from where I stand and from where we stand at FCS, there are some simple choices. You can reduce your meat and dairy product consumption. That gets back at those two major sources of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, methane from cows and also nitrogen fertilizer use. A lot of nitrogen fertilizer use goes to growing feed grains that feed cows as well. So really reducing your meat consumption is the biggest thing you can do. That's a very sticky snake pit of nuance that we can get into later. We have a lot of meat producers in our ranks, and there are times and places and ways in which producing meat can be done sustainably. And so it's not a wholesale, this is not a wholesale sort of ixnay on eating meat. The second thing you can do is reduce the consumption of food produced using synthetic nitrogen, and that involves a certain extent of getting to know your farmers, or you know, ties into the third point. Basically, if you buy food and you're able to buy food from organic, regenerative, and ecological farmers, you know that likely there's not a lot of synthetic nitrogen being used there. So those are three pretty safe guidelines for your own individual choices. And I'll leave it at that for now. And as a parting note, saying if you're interested at all in Farmers for Climate Solutions and the work we do, there's opportunities to get involved. You can sign up for the newsletter. You can share content with your networks from our newsletter and from our website. We do have public education campaigns and campaigns where we have calls to action for the public, and you'll get that through the newsletter as well. Or you can join one of our member organizations and volunteer for them. They're all doing great work. So I'm going to leave it there for now, and hope that I didn't go over time. And I'll look forward to hearing Shannon and diving into questions later.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was great. And maybe you could copy those links into the chat so that folks have easy access to them while we're just kind of transitioning over. I know I learned a lot. I think that was a really good kind of system overview and policy overview. When we think about food, we often think about, well, it starts at the grocery store. And in fact, that's not true at all. There's so much that goes into it beforehand. So that's a really interesting perspective that you bring. Now I am going to pass it over to Shannon. Just quickly before I do, I saw some Q&A and chat, and that's awesome. Again, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat, you are super welcome to. And if you have any questions at any stage about anything we're talking about, put it in the Q&A. That way, when we get to that time, it'll be easy to just kind of start going through them. Okay. I just wanted to plug that in. Shannon, if you're ready and you want to bring up your screen, I'll pass it over to you. Shannon is going to be giving a presentation on what is the carbon footprint of your meal. So Shannon, I'll let you take it away. And Shannon, just so you know, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. Can everyone see that fine now?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you so much, Andrew. We're so grateful as Bow Valley Climate Action for Andrew for volunteering to present tonight. And it is such a pleasure to present alongside Andrew. We've known each other for, I guess, more than 15 years. Andrew and his partner and I all lived within about a block of one another in Vancouver and have spent a lot of meals and a lot of wonderful time together. I'm really looking forward to the conversation this evening. I really enjoyed Andrew's presentation. The topic of what is the carbon footprint of my meal is something I've been interested in, even on a personal level, for quite some time, and I really enjoyed um, the process of preparing this presentation. So as Andrew very eloquently explained, food and the topic of food is very nuanced and it's very personal. And I thought coming into this presentation that it might be helpful to very briefly introduce myself and describe very briefly about my food lens before I start talking about this concept of what is the carbon footprint of my meal. I grew up in Fort Macleod, which is a small agricultural community in southern Alberta of about 3,000 people. My mom grew up on a small scale family cattle ranch near Pincher Creek, between Pincher Creek and Waterton. The photo there on the upper left is of the farm only about 3 days ago when we were planting the gardens there this past weekend. We continued to go back to that farm to enjoy producing food there for our family. My granddad, who farmed the ranch and has passed away, now it's my cousins who live in the area who have cattle that graze there, as well as some neighbors. On the upper right, you can see some of the cows grazing at the farm. I've been very fortunate. I've had a chance to go to university and be trained in environmental and conservation science. And then I later went on to do my master's degree in soil science. And I was very privileged to have the chance to live and work alongside livestock owners and landowners in northwestern Argentina in the province of Jujuy for my master's research. And in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see my dear friend Miguel with his horse at his land in Argentina. And the focus of that research was looking at the impacts of livestock grazing on a variety of different forest types in Argentina, working alongside livestock owners who were concerned that their animals were dying in the dry season because they didn't have enough forage to eat and were interested in more sustainable grazing management practices. I lived in Yellowknife for 8 years, and we were very fortunate to have a chicken coop there. You can see the photo in the center of the chickens. And then over the last number of years, both in Yellowknife and now here in the Bow Valley, I've been working in the field of composting and waste diversion. So I acknowledge each of our previous experience color how we look at the topic of food, our food culture, and it is something that's very personal. One of the amazing things about food is it connects us. Each time we sit down for a meal, we're connected, even though we might not know who they are. We're connected with the farmers who have produced our food, with the animals who've been involved who've given of themselves or of their products to us if we're consuming animal products. There's a lot of connections when we eat. And it's also a time of much social relationship and bonding when we eat together with friends or family. And as Andrew mentioned, when we start layering and bringing together the coming together of climate change and agriculture, it's so important that we think of how we can acknowledge and think about and work on this issue together. So it's not pitting the consumers of food against the farmers of food. It's how can we work together and support one another. I care deeply about the people who produce the food that we eat as a family. I care deeply about the global environment. I care deeply about the local environments where food is being produced and where food isn't being produced, that there's enough space for wildlife. And so I think about what are the food choices that I can make that support farmers and the local and global environment. And also, again, I think it was so important what Andrew mentioned. It's not just about personal choices, but how can we together work towards a societal change that enable us to achieve our climate goals that we must meet in a way that's equitable and that acknowledges the complicated landscape of some of these conversations. So as a brief overview of what are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with food systems and food production. There was quite a landmark report that came out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's through the United Nations. It was released in the fall of 2019, and it was focused on climate change and land. And that report, it's by, I think it was more than 100 different scientists who wrote it together. It summarized that about 25 to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, so total emissions worldwide, come from the food system. So as we've spoken about already, it's really important if we're going to tackle climate change and make a big difference in reducing our emissions, agriculture has to be part of that conversation. And so as a global comparison, electricity and heat production are about the similar amount of the proportion of greenhouse gas emissions, 25%, industry is less, and transportation is less again. So agriculture is very important. And of that 25% to 30% that's agriculture, it's very interesting if you start breaking it down according to the types of agriculture. So again, this speaks a bit to what Andrew was, Andrew was speaking about earlier. If we take food, if it makes up about a quarter of total greenhouse gas emissions, of that proportion that's food, 58% is coming from the greenhouse gases associated with animal products. So either animal meat or dairy products. And of that, 50% of that is beef and lamb. So it's not all equal in terms of the greenhouse gases associated with different foods and different types of agriculture. This graph here came from a paper by the authors Poor and Nemecek in 2018. And it was basically a meta-analysis or a study that summarized many other studies of agriculture and climate and greenhouse gas emissions. So we've been chatting and talking about carbon footprint, and there's also the concept of environmental footprint. I thought I'd take a brief step back and ask the question, what are these and how are they measured or calculated? A carbon footprint, or the notion of a carbon footprint, basically is the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are caused directly and indirectly by whether it be an individual, an organization, an event, or a product. In this case, we're looking at different types of food choices or foods or types of agriculture and what the carbon footprint is. A carbon footprint, it's the combined emissions from every stage of a product or service's lifetime, or in this case, a food product. And we'll get into all of the different components of the carbon footprint of food. And it includes all of the various types of greenhouse gases. So whether that be carbon dioxide or gases such as methane or nitrous oxide, which each of them has a different capacity to warm the Earth's atmosphere. But in the calculation of carbon footprint, they are taken together, and the global warming potential of each gas is normalized so that you end up with a carbon dioxide equivalent. When we think about about food and agriculture and its footprint, it's also really important to consider all of the other impacts or potential impacts that agriculture can have. So greenhouse gas emissions and climate change is one factor, but there are many other ones that we also need to consider and think about. We need to think about the amount of land used for different types of agriculture, fresh water use, nutrient cycling, and also biodiversity. And so there's a lot of different things to think about, and these all get wrapped up into the concept of what is the environmental footprint of different foods. So as I mentioned, the two authors, Poor and Nemecek, released a very interesting study in the scientific journal Science. This was in 2019, I guess 2018, 2019. I'm not going to linger long on this page. It looks a little bit scary, but I wanted to make a note of it in case you're interested in the details and want to go seek it out. They basically looked at hundreds of scientific studies that looked at the different impacts of various types of food. And then they combined them together and came up with an analysis. So I'm going to draw your attention. If you'll see here, there's in the first column is greenhouse gas emissions. You'll see gray arrow bars. And the fact that these gray arrow bars extend across the chart is showing that there's actually a lot of variability, even in each type of food. So whether it's beef or crustaceans or cheese or tofu, for example, there is an arrow bar there that it represents the variability of the greenhouse gas emissions produced in producing that. Basically signifying and representing that farms can work in very different ways, and the greenhouse gas impacts from one particular farm farming the exact same food might be very different in one part of the world to another. And same goes for water, for the scarcity of water factor, or for nutrient use. And so that study by Poor and Nemecek, it got a lot of traction. There's a lot of conversation around that when it first came out. And so the organization Our World in Data in this chart here took that research from Poor and Nemecek and made it into a visual that's a little bit easier for most people to understand. So this chart shows greenhouse gas emissions across the supply chain. If you look first just at the bars in the graph, you can see on the left are the different food types. So beef on the top having the greatest greenhouse gas footprint, and then working all the way down to nuts, which have a very, very small greenhouse gas footprint. And then everything in between there, you can have a look. I think there might be a few surprises in there if you have a look. I know chocolate and coffee were surprising to me. If you look within each bar, you can see the different colors. And I also found this really interesting when I started looking at these graphs. You can see the green is land use change. That's the greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from, say, cutting down a forest to make a pasture land, changing the land so that it can be used for agriculture. The brown is from farming, from production, whether it be use of fertilizers, manure management, all of the things that are entailed in the farming of the product. Something I would really be interested for you to have a look at is the pink, which is transport. I think often we're told that, oh, if we buy local, we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by a huge amount. I think there's a ton of benefits in purchasing local, and one of the biggest ones being knowing the people who are producing your food and being able to understand their food systems. But the transportation alone and the distance your food, the distance your food is from, I guess, where it's farmed to getting to you is a very small part of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the different food types. So if you on your own after this presentation would like to explore your own diet a little bit more, there's a couple of tools here. And I guess once Alyssa has uploaded this presentation to the BBCA website, you'll be able to go and check them out. BBC News has a climate change food calculator based on this study. And then again, Our World in Data out of Oxford University has, you can go through and actually adjust the types of products in the food types within each of these graphs. And you can even change around, if you notice here in this, on the right-hand side of the slide, you can change the metric by like 1 kilogram of food produces how many kilograms of greenhouse gases, or per 100 grams of protein. You can adjust it and look at stages of the supply chain. It's pretty interesting playing around with the graphs there. So there's a couple of tools if you're interested in exploring that more. Also acknowledging there's always limitations to these things. The BBC one is based in the UK, but it does give you an order of magnitude sense of these different concepts that are found in these charts. And I also would like to acknowledge most of the time these charts aren't acknowledging traditional practices such as hunting and gathering, which are important ways of accessing food both culturally and in terms of nutrition, and aren't reflected often in these types of calculators. So when we look at the carbon footprint of food, as I mentioned, really the main part of the greenhouse gases are associated with the production of food. So we'll see here, this is just a different way to express this. This is from Johns Hopkins University, showing that really the vast majority of the greenhouse gases are associated with producing the food, a small amount in the transportation and retail. And Andrew spoke quite a bit, thank you, Andrew, to the different types of parts of production of food that generate greenhouse gas emissions. Again, briefly, land use change, if there was land use change to start producing a particular food, inputs such as fertilizer, pesticides, animal feed, manure management is a big one in terms of agriculture, of farming of animals and livestock. Ruminant digestion is a very big one, especially with respect to ruminants, so animals such as cattle and goats and sheep. And a couple here at the bottom I've highlighted in blue and red. Eating food and food waste, those are not normally included within these estimates of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with food, but they are very important things, and they're things that each of us as individuals can take action on in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and I'll get to those in a little bit. So one question I had and I found really interesting to learn about is, why do the emissions vary for each food item? So this is a graph made by the BBC, but representing this research by Poor and Nemechek. You can see how wide the bars are for some of these products, especially say beef. The lowest impact beef operation has a lot lower greenhouse gas footprint than high impact. And it varies according to the food type, how wide that diversity of greenhouse gas emissions is. And as noted here in the chart, there's a lot of different factors that go into producing a food, and there's a lot of different ways that farms can be producing one particular food. Land use change, and whether land use change has had to happen in order for agriculture to take place, is one of the biggest sources of variability. So for example, beef that's produced in Latin America and that has been produced especially in places where the tropical rainforest has been cut down to produce pasture. So quite a lot of that happening in, say, Brazil, Paraguay, other parts of Latin America. That would be some of the beef that has the very highest impact in terms of greenhouse gas emission. On the other hand, low impact beef, here in Alberta, we would have some pretty low impact beef that's being raised on rangelands where there wasn't clearing that had to happen in order for the beef to be produced, and it's produced in a different way. The amount of land needed for each animal unit can really have make a big difference in terms of emissions. And as Andrew spoke to, the production inputs. So whether synthetic fertilizers are being used or not, basically the production of nitrogen fertilizer and the production of ammonia is extremely energy intensive. It's high pressure, it takes a lot of energy for it to occur, and the chemical reaction of doing it releases carbon dioxide. So that combination means that when synthetic nitrogen fertilizers are used, there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. And again, we spoke about animal production techniques, how you manage your manure makes a difference, and even things such as the type of feed used. So we've spoken a bit about why are there so many greenhouse gas emissions associated with livestock. We spoke about the methane released from digestion and from manure. Another thing that is a component of this is the fact that livestock are higher up the food chain. There's a lot of cropland that's used to produce food, which is then used to produce the meat of the livestock. And anytime you go up the food chain, there are inefficiencies in terms of that conversion of the plant energy into the animal energy. And it means that ultimately it takes a lot more energy and a lot more water to produce that final kilogram of meat than it does the same quantity of vegetable protein. So we've spoken about livestock and beef and their huge impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. I also wanted to speak to some of the nuance of the topic and how livestock grazing done in the right place and in the right way can actually support biodiversity. And it's where the conversation becomes more nuanced and a little bit more complex. I'm highlighting here on this slide the work of both the Nature Conservancy of Canada and the Southern Alberta Land Trust Society in Southern Alberta, in the rangelands and the parkland that's in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, all along the foothills down, and especially in the case of the Nature Conservancy around Waterton Lakes National Park, there's been a lot of effort made to place conservation easements on land that is currently being used for ranching. The ranching continues on the land, but it means that that land is protected, and it means it's then protected for all of the wildlife that are using the land and for all of the different species at risk and species generally that are living in these areas that are ultimately very biodiverse and really important in terms of the functioning of the ecosystem. When the range managers, the ranchers that are using that land, protect that land, when they use rotational grazing that ensures that there's good soil carbon, that there is good cover so erosion isn't happening, these systems can really have a positive impact on both biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. And just as an example, I spoke about the family farm and where my granddad raised cattle and where my cousins raise cattle now. We just had it's called multi-species at risk assessment done last year in the area of the farm. And we found it really interesting to learn this spring when we chatted with the people who did the work, the wildlife biologists. There were so many species at risk that are present on that land. And they're present on that land when it's being used currently for livestock grazing. If that land was to be broken up and used for cropland, the habitat that's currently being used by all of the species there would be lost. And certainly it's very much not our intention as a family to ever break up that land. It's native grassland, which there's very little of left in the province, and it's really important wildlife habitat along with currently being used for grazing. And I guess more broadly, in terms of producers, we have that question, how can producers reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Andrew did a wonderful job of speaking to this. I won't spend long on it. But again, the top ones are nitrogen management, doing more with less synthetic nitrogen, cover cropping, the various ways we can increase soil organic matter, including no-till and conservation tillage. And those would be focused on cropland. For livestock, one of the main things is rotational grazing. And again, all the different ways the land can be cared for to increase the amount of carbon in the soil. Improving manure management so there's less methane generated, which was where composting comes in, and the different ways that livestock can be raised. So this is where us as consumers of food comes in. Eating food. Now it seems like a funny thing, but one way we can definitely reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with food is by eating food and not letting it go to waste. As I did the research for this presentation, I was even astounded myself. So currently globally, the UN has reported that 25 to 30% of all the food produced in the world is lost or wasted. So if we address that alone, we would be making a huge contribution to not needing to put new land into agriculture to feed more people and to make better use of our resources. In Canada, unfortunately, if you see in this chart here, it's 58%. 58% of the food produced in Canada is lost or wasted each year. So in terms of motivating ourselves and taking action, even if we just took action on that as those of us eating food who maybe aren't producers of food in a big way beyond our own small gardens, this is an enormous opportunity. And I want to really give a shout out and a thank you to the people in our communities here in Banff and Canmore and the Bow Valley, and if there's anyone on from Yellowknife and communities across around the world who are really working on creating the systems that enable restaurants and grocery stores to donate excess food rather than having it go wasted. So in Canmore, it's the Canmore Food Recovery Barn. In Banff, it's Banff Food Rescue. Yellowknife, it's Yellowknife Food Rescue. There's organizations like this all throughout Canada that are really helping people to keep food on the higher parts of the food recovery hierarchy. So reducing wasted food, donating excess food. Next up would be feeding animals. If you have animals that can eat food animals like chickens or that type of thing. And then after that is composting. So I'm gonna see if this works here to play the short video from Metro Vancouver.
Shannon, we can't hear the audio, but it is really cute.
Oh, oh dear, okay.
And while I
Basically-
have you, just a few more minutes left.
Perfect, thanks Alyssa. I'll move on to the next one. Sorry about that. Basically, the orange peel there is producing methane and being told that if you keep the methane out of the landfill, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, about 25 times that of carbon dioxide. So basically with food scraps, for every 1 ton of food scraps that's kept out of the landfill, 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions are saved. And thanks to Metro Vancouver for making that great video. Sorry you couldn't hear the audio. And not only making it, but making it available to other communities to use for free. Again, thank you to the town of Banff, the town of Canmore for creating food composting programs that enable residents and now the commercial sector to separate out their food scraps for composting. There's some photos here of people composting. On the right is Ms. Kish at ERS school here in Canmore, and then individuals in Banff and Canmore. And thank you to the Recycling Council of Alberta. They recently made a great introductory guide to on-farm composting to help more farmers in Alberta learn about how they might be able to accept food scraps from communities like Banff or Canmore, convert them into compost, and then use the compost on their farms, which is a really important part of the greenhouse gas emission savings with compost, is having the nutrients from the food scraps and the carbon from the food scraps go into the agricultural soil and be nutrients for the next set of plants that are going to be growing. So very briefly, how can I reduce the carbon footprint of my meal? We've gone through, we've kind of looked at some of the main things. As Andrew mentioned, consider eating fewer meat and dairy products if this fits with your food culture and values. I'm definitely not here to tell people what to eat, and I think it's a very personal choice, but this is going through what are some of the things people can consider doing to help reduce your footprint. Buy food from producers who use organic, regenerative, and ecological farming practices. Prevent food waste. That's something we can all do in our households. Compost food scraps, and advocate and work for this collective action that makes number 1 to 4 happen. As an example, if your community doesn't have a composting program, maybe try and set one up so people can compost their food scraps. That would be an example. And here on the right is a diagram of what's called the Planetary Health Diet. So the Lancet Medical Journal has done a lot of work around how can people eat healthy for themselves as people and healthy for the planet. And something I found interesting, what they are proposing, you can see the diagram there on the right, mainly fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and with small amounts of animal protein. It mirrors very much what the Canada Food Guide recommends we should be eating. And the food guide itself suggests that it's good for us to choose protein foods that come from plants as often as we're able to, and a little more often. As a little tip, there's a lot of great recipes on the Canada Food Guide website that help, maybe diversify your cooking and include more lentils. Getting towards the end here, this sounds like it's a funny little add-on, but I also want to say when you're delving into this topic, if you're doing more research, just to stress, as with any type of research or learning, to access high quality information. I found it very interesting as I worked on this. For example, the UN reports are written by many, many, many scientists. They are peer reviewed. As an example, the climate change and land report I referred to, and which this presentation is for the most part based on, it had 107 coordinating lead authors and review editors who came from 52 different countries. So that is a high quality resource for information. Many people have spoken about it. They've reviewed, they've decided, okay, we're going to write this, and we all agree that this is true and that this is what we're going to put in the report. On the other hand, if you find one single person who is saying, oh, what the United Nations had to say, that doesn't make any sense, use caution. As an example, there is a researcher based in California who is giving presentations. I recently was invited by the professional association I'm a member of to go to a talk and where he was suggesting that the UN reports were incorrect. So just be really careful. Look for high quality information when you're seeking out, you're learning and working on learning around this topic, and be careful of individuals who on their own and not in peer reviewed journals are questioning the research that's come from either peer reviewed papers and specifically UN reports. I'm not going to go through these. I've listed a few helpful tools and resources you might want to check out to further your own learning on these topics. Thank you so much for participating. I look forward to the trivia and the questions.
Thanks so much, Shannon, for all that information. That was a lot, but I think you made it really easy to digest, and thank you for your personal stories too. I don't think we're going to have time for trivia, but what I will do is I will email out the trivia slides that we put together, and if anyone's interested in doing a little family game tomorrow night, you can open that up, and it's just some fun questions about what we've talked about already, so you can review tomorrow. But I do, while we have a few minutes left, want to answer a few questions. And Andrew, thank you so much for answering a few of them already. There was 2 questions from Mike and from Robert that Andrew typed answers to, which you can see by clicking on the answered section in the Q&A. And then there's a few more that we haven't gotten to yet, so maybe we'll start with those and we can circle back to the ones that you typed answers to, Andrew. There's one in the chat that I'll start with so I don't lose it, from Jody, who asks, I find talking about climate change and agriculture can be a contentious issue, especially here in cattle-led Alberta. How would you recommend we start or continue the conversations that we've had tonight? And maybe Andrew, I can pass it over to you first for that.
That's such a great question, and I would turn it right over to an Alberta resource that I've really enjoyed dipping into now and then, the Alberta Narratives Project reports that were put out by the Pembina Institute, among other folks, that kind of address the broader topic of talking about climate change in an energy-rich province in general. And, like if my memory serves me correctly, if you've come across that report, or if you haven't, some of the really main things were, first of all, you have to meet people where they're at, and you obviously can't alienate people. There's a lot of people's identities hang on their work, and if their work is in the energy sector or in the agriculture sector, in the beef sector in Alberta, it's really important to acknowledge how deep and important those identity pieces are for people, and to value and appeal to the value that people bring to society through their work. And so, that's like a really vague answer to your question. It doesn't give you any like specific tools, but I think there's a lot of acknowledging how difficult and Shannon, I know you've read this report too, and maybe you have it more kind of fresh at the top of your mind, but there's a lot of acknowledging where people are at in their lives and the value that they bring to the world, but how we, moving from there to find a place of common ground where you can move forward together in a way that doesn't threaten people, basically, make them feel threatened.
Definitely. And thank you, Jody, for finding that link and putting it in the chat. And we also last year ran a webinar with Alberta Narratives Project. So if you're interested in watching that and hearing more about what Andrew's talking about, you can find that on our Facebook page. Shannon, did you have anything to add to that question of how do you start those conversations?
That was excellent, Andrew. I feel like Andrew did an excellent job, and unfortunately, it's not top of my mind either. But I think you said it very well, Andrew. I agree. Yeah, and it's hard. I think acknowledging it's hard, and yet at the same time, the importance of having those difficult conversations. It is super difficult. Andrew, if I recall, like in some cases, your work that you're doing with farmers, would you be approaching it in different ways with different groups, kind of following those principles?
Yeah, it's a good point. FCS is such an interesting organization for me, coming from like, I come from a sort of quote unquote progressive sustainable farming background, like mostly organic farming. And, you know, a lot of the people that have like pioneered the BMPs, the best management practices that we're trying to run this training program focused on have come from that organic regenerative world. Working with farmers across the country and trying to bring them all under the same umbrella, it's part marketing. You know what I mean? In Alberta and Saskatchewan, it's not that we're not using the word climate, like it's right there in our name, but we are downplaying the word climate, and we're focusing more in those regions on, you know, what you call the co-benefits of adopting any of these practices, of which there are many, and they're legitimate co-benefits. So if somebody, we may be working directly with, I don't think we're working with too many climate change deniers, but we may be working with people who are skeptical, that's for sure. And for those folks, we're really hammering on how adopting these practices bring economic benefits to your farm. They bring other ecological benefits to your farm that we know a lot of farmers really appreciate, whether it's wildlife diversity or better soil or better water retention capacity in your soil, or nutrient retention capacity in your soil, or whether it's being able to withstand what they can see and feel as shifts in weather as climate change kind of digs in its teeth. You know, in the impact sense, if your soil is in a better spot, you're going to be able to withstand those vagaries a lot better. And those appeal to farmers, if not the kind of climate benefits. So absolutely, we have to package it differently and focus on those co-benefits in places like Alberta. And those are all legit too.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew. Question in the Q&A. This one's an interesting one. Are there any efforts, it's from Robert Tremblay, sorry. Are there any efforts to certify or brand low carbon and sustainable Alberta beef? And I might even expand that to just food in general. And what can you tell us about that, if that even exists? I don't know if either of you want to take the reins on that question.
I don't mind jumping in, but Shannon, do you want to go first? Do you have a...
Sure, I'll go first briefly. I'm not aware of any. Now, I will preface that by the fact I'm just not in that world in a deep way. So I think there are quite a number of producers working to market their own beef as grass-fed. Like I know I have the cousins that have some of those cows that you saw in the photos there that have set up their own website and are focusing on producing grass-fed beef and marketing it directly, which gives them more income. It enables them to then keep the animals in the pasture rather than sending them to feedlot, pardon me. And I know that's been a really successful strategy for them. They're not branding it more broadly, like that's pretty local sales. But that's a very good question you ask, Robert, and I'll ask Andrew. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Andrew, from your...
Yeah, as far as I know, there's no formal program, certainly not like certified organic, but what there is, so a proxy perhaps is the whole idea of regenerative agriculture, which is kind of picking up speed. And there are now only 3 certified regenerative farms in Canada, one of which is my boss's farm, but that's in Ontario. But I know that you know, that's sort of a proxy for kind of climate friendly or low carbon agriculture, because there's a lot of work done to kind of sequester carbon in soils through regenerative agriculture and prevent emissions through various sustainable farming practices. So that's one thing you could look for. But the other thing that's kind of exciting is the Weston Family Foundation has just put out a call for funding proposals or letters of intent to get funding. And one of the things that they're funding are efforts from organizations to create certification schemes for not specifically low carbon agriculture, but practices that could be lumped into that basket again as well. So I think it's just a matter of time, because also the supply chain is demanding it in different ways. And this is another way back to the question of how do you continue this conversation with people in Alberta, especially when it comes to nitrogen management. The supply chain is demanding that farmers reduce nitrogen very heavily. And what we're pitching to farmers, and this is also really legit, is get in now, get training now to figure out how you can reduce your nitrogen, because then you have control over how you do it. If you don't get in now, you're going to be regulated. It's just a matter of time. So I think a lot of those initiatives are on the way.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that. Thank you. Thank you both. Okay, and then I think we have one more question, and if anyone has any other burning questions, we can probably stay on for an extra minute or two, so feel free to still put them in the question and answer. But a final question that we have here from Robert as well is, I think based on the charts that you were showing, Shannon, do we know where typical average Alberta ground beef places on GHG intensity compared to, I'm guessing, other places in Canada?
That's an excellent, great questions, Robert. Thank you. I am very much not an expert in this field, so these are just the papers and the reports I've been reading recently in the charts. But it certainly seemed that overall Alberta beef is lower on that spectrum of greenhouse gas emissions, with the main reasons being, in Alberta, we haven't cleared tropical rainforest to do agriculture. Like the farms on the far side of the high tend to be in areas where forest has been cleared to produce beef. I would venture that maybe in northern Alberta, where there's some of that happening, clearing a boreal forest to make pastures, maybe the impact would be a little bit higher than in areas that have native grassland. That's my general sense. So on the lower side of things, but I will also very clearly say that I'm not an expert in this area. Andrew, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, I'm definitely not an expert in that area either. Nothing to add.
Really good to know, though. Yeah. Okay, I don't see any other questions, but I am watching in case anything pops up. But I guess with all that being said, that brings us to the end of our webinar, What's the Carbon Footprint of My Meal? So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Shannon and Andrew, for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you to the Biosphere for letting us use their Zoom, and to our funders who we talked about at the beginning. I put a link in the chat to a little survey. It should take like 2 to 3 minutes. That would just give us some feedback on how you enjoyed the webinar to help us improve for future. And other than that, I will send out the little trivia game we had put together, and you can brush up on what you learned tonight tomorrow. So with all that said, thank you everyone for joining. We hope you've had some food for thought and retained some of what our presenters talked about, of some steps we can take, from reducing the food that has synthetic nitrogen, to reducing food waste, to advocating for the policy solutions. There's so many steps and so many places to be involved, and this is a very personal decision to make, but there's lots of different places where you can enter this realm of work and reducing our carbon footprint. So thank you for joining, and have a great evening.